before I ever met anyone who was Chinese. I grew up in St. Catharines. It was very homogeneous. Moved to Toronto, did my graduate degree in history, and got a job with a master's degree in medieval history. It was not easy. I got a job at the Ministry of Transportation and Communications. And my first boss was an engineer named Andrew Yu, who had come to Canada from Hong Kong. And I was thinking as I was sitting here about the fact that Andrew sort of took it upon himself to educate me about China and Chinese culture, and how, even though I was a history English major, Andrew Yu, a Chinese engineer from Hong Kong, taught me how to write. And a lot of my career has been based on the fact that I'm now a good writer. I wasn't when I graduated with my master's degree from the University of Toronto. I remember I wrote the first report. I was very proud of it. It had lots of long words. It was, 50 pages long. And he took it away and he chopped it down to about 10 pages and showed me how to think systematically and in a structured way. And shortly after that, my next boss was a man named Stan Wong, who taught me about program evaluation, which again has been the foundation of my career. So I was just thinking about that as I was sitting there. And the other thought that came to my mind is I was in my 40s. In my 40s. I had studied history. I was in my 40s before I heard anything about the Chinese head tax. Because I was helping my daughter with her homework. And she had a project to create a diary of someone who was Chinese and had come to Canada, and it forced her to do all the research and learn about the experience. I was in my 40s before I learned that. I think I was in my 50s before I went to the Canadian Museum of History and saw the exhibition on the building of the Canadian Railroad, Canadian National Railroad. We all study history, built the country, yay. I was in my 50s before I learned that between 10 and 12,000 Chinese people worked on building the Canadian National Railway, and that 10% of them died in doing it. And I'm a reasonably well-educated Canadian-born citizen. I did not know any of this. And so, again, I want to thank Dr. Stanley for the amazing talk, and to simply say, I wish it were a talk not to a room full of primarily people of Chinese origin. It should be a talk that everybody hears about. Because since the murder of George Floyd, all of us have learned a lot more about the history of anti-Black racism around the world and in Canada. Since the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops, BC, of Indigenous children, we've learned a lot more about the genocide that was committed in Canada. And I have to admit, again, it wasn't until that happened that I learned the story of deliberate distribution of blankets with smallpox to Indigenous peoples. I'm in my 60s when I learned that, right? So I have to say that, in my view, education is necessary but insufficient. And we know that education does not create action. And I have to absolutely agree with Dr. Stanley that action requires political engagement, And I would also say it requires the engagement of industry. And that's really the focus of the work that we do at the Diversity Institute. So I started working on issues related to diversity and inclusion a long time ago, with a focus on women in technology. That was how I got started. And I have to say, having worked on that for 30 years, it was the Montreal Massacre that precipitated my interest in that. Having worked on it for 30 years, I'm an abject failure because there are fewer women in computer science today and not only marginally more in engineering after 30 years of talk. And that's part of the reason why I so much agree with what Dr. Stanley said about the difference between words and actions. Because we've been talking about women in technology for 30 years. We are not making a lot of progress. I also, from that, started working more on other dimensions of equity, diversity, and inclusion because it was obvious that there were parallels. And also, you know, as I was speaking to funny story, I was in a committee meeting. We had a Montreal Massacre memorial meeting. And I was also working on the issue of gun control at the same time. I was the head of I was the president of the Coalition for Gun Control. And I was working with an engineer named Peter Hiscox. And they were looking for someone to go and teach equity issues to all the first-year engineers at Ryerson. So this was in 1990. And there weren't many women in engineering at Ryerson at the time. And the head of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Ryerson at the time said, "I'm not going in there. They're scary, I'm not going in there." And Peter said, he said, "Wendy will do it. She goes into rooms full of guys who own guns, she'll do anything." And that was how, that's honestly the truth. That's how I got into working on issues with women in technology. I was sort of pushed into it. It wasn't my training. It had been my experience because I had worked in technology and I'd seen what the experience of women was like in that field. But I just fell into doing the work around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the work that we started then expanded and expanded and expanded. And our focus, because I'm based in a business school, our focus has been very much grounded not in arguments of social justice, although clearly they are important in the foundation, and given my lived experience as the child of a refugee who watched lots of things happen, I'm deeply committed to the social justice argument. But we really push hard on the business case, the economic case, because people who don't understand equity, diversity, and inclusion and how important it is to Canada clearly don't understand what it is to compete and thrive in a global economy. So everything that we've done has really come from that, orientation. And I wanted to say, you know, the Diversity Institute's now 130 full-time staff working on different projects that are aimed at improving access to education, improving skills development, driving entrepreneurship, all through an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. And I just wanted to give a shout out to some of my staff who took the time to come today. I didn't see all of them, but of course, Lin Xu, who's the Director of Finance and Admin, Dr. Guang Mo, who is our Director of Research, who really has done most of the research that we have produced on these issues over the last few years. I think I saw Saif Rahman, who has done a lot of the work, he's a PhD student in entrepreneurship, has done a lot of our work focused on building equity and inclusion in entrepreneurship. And of course with Cpac, we organized an event not long ago which Mo and Lynn helped lead, because it became very clear to us that many Chinese entrepreneurs were not aware of some of the supports and programs that were available. And I think I saw Joy Lee as well, who is one of our project coordinators. So there may be others, I apologize, but we have quite a big team that we're, oh, sorry, Betty Zhang. Thank you, Lynn, thank you. Yeah, Betty Zhang, who works also as a project manager, coordinator, and also got me a parking spot. So if you saw her shooing you away, that's because she was saving the spot for me. And of course, there are a lot more people who have helped us do this work. But part of what makes the Diversity Institute so strong is we do have a lot of people with lived experience. And that brings something to the research that is very different than just looking at the numbers. I have to say that it is very clear from the research that everything that Dr. Stanley said about systemic discrimination generally and anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism is documented and demonstrated at every single stage of the work that we do. One of the things that I think happened, I could be wrong, but I think that COVID brought to the surface anti-Asian racism in a way we've never seen before, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there. And one of the things that I found really interesting is when we used to do studies, for example, of newcomers, and we would segment based on different ethnic groups, those who identified as Black always reported a lot more discrimination than those who identified as Chinese. And yet, once we started talking about anti-Asian racism during the period of COVID, we started hearing the stories that we had never heard before. And my conclusion is that a lot of the research that we did, which was based on people's reports of whether they experienced racism and discrimination, was distorted by the fact that people of Chinese origin tend to place more value on stoicism and strength, and simply were not complaining. Because the evidence is pretty clear. The evidence is pretty clear that it's been a problem for many, many years, and frankly, it's still a problem. Regardless of your politics, for example, the way that Minister Mary Ng was treated in the media was partly a function of the fact she was a woman, and if you're a woman, you're a target. But there's no question. It's also because she was a Chinese woman and the first Chinese woman in cabinet that people were calling for her resignation when others have done far more egregious things and were left untouched. So I think, you know, the research, the lived experience all really reinforces the reality of everything that Dr. Stanley was talking about today. And you know, as others have said, sometimes racism in Canada is there, but it's politer, right? So it's coached in other kinds of language. We were doing a study for the Greater Vancouver Regional Real Estate Board, and one of the things that surfaced in those discussions was the racist impact of some of the new legislation restricting foreign buyers of real estate, right? Not only because of the impact it had on foreign buyers, but the impact it had on landed immigrants, people who were here on work permits, etc. But also people who had lived in Canada for many, many, many years were being attacked and criticized in the real estate processes. People didn't want to sell real estate to Chinese Canadians because of this discourse that was created about immigrants driving foreign investors driving real estate up. And the evidence is very clear, it's not real. It's not real. That isn't the reason real estate prices are going up. So we see even today many of the things that Dr. Stanley talked about. The research that Cpac did a couple of years ago, which Andy talked about, also really opened my eyes to the issues around stereotypes. And again, I think one of the reasons that anti-Asian racism may get overlooked is because, in general, people of Chinese background do well, right? Economically, they're highly educated. They do well. You look at the Stats Canada data. It's not as obvious that they're being marginalized because they do well. They work hard, they succeed, they do well. But when you start to look at leadership, when you start to look at stereotypes, when you start to look at the underrepresentation of this very well-educated segment of the population in leadership roles, it starts to tell you something about how decisions happen and how, again, racism is baked into the processes. I don't want to leave, though, on a very negative note, because I think it's always when we talk about these things, whether we're talking about the Black community, whether we're talking about the Indigenous community, whether we're talking about persons with disabilities, or the Chinese community, it is important to recognize that we have made progress. You know, and I mentioned we have a Chinese woman who is in cabinet. We had a woman of Chinese origin who was our Governor General, and you can go through the list of more and more high-profile Chinese success stories in Canada. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. We can also look at some of the initiatives that are underway to create more equitable workplaces, and we're very committed to continuing to work, for example, on things like the 50-30 challenge. 50-30 challenge was introduced by the government with the intention of advancing gender equity, that's parity, that's the 50%, and increased diversity on boards, that's the 30%. And what we have to make sure is in that increased diversity, there are strategies in the Chinese community to advance candidates for leadership roles. Because I think one of the things, again, and I say this based on dealing with colleagues who are of Chinese background, there are values around humility and respect and modesty and so on that tend to be characteristic of the way in which people are raised, as opposed to a lot of the stereotypical behavior of leaders is they're assertive, they're aggressive, they're confident, right? They speak out, they talk a lot. It's why women get called bossy. Men never get called bossy because it's assumed that they're bosses. And the research that Andy and his team led, which showed that Chinese people are respected as experts, but not considered as leaders, has a lot to do with ethnic stereotypes around what leadership looks like. And that's something that we have to combat, but we also have to bring forward well-qualified Chinese people who aspire to leadership roles, provide them with the mentoring, the sponsoring, and the supports that they need to get into the boardroom and lead organizations. There's lots of work to do, but we think we have some tools, and again, more than education, we actually need instruments, we need tools, we need strategies, we need action, but we feel optimistic, and with our partnership with Cpac, we see lots of opportunities to move forward. So I want to end by saying thank you to all of you for coming today. Thank you to Cpac for the award, and thank you for Dr. Stanley for teaching an old dog some new tricks. I'm sorry for breaking the microphone.